So I'm gonna pass the baton over to Mike Spelman, who is a 40-year veteran in the financial printing industry, and as of the last 18 to 20 years, he was focused solely on proxy statements and annual reports. So, Mike.
Well, thank you, Jim. Appreciate it. Good morning, everybody, and thanks for joining us. We really appreciate it. Hopefully, traffic wasn't much of a deterrent getting here. Today, we're joined by a group of industry leaders to talk about issues that affect issuers on a routine basis. The presentation is going to be set up where each of the panelists will go through a PowerPoint presentation. Upon conclusion of each of these sections that we're going to be addressing, questions will be fielded from the audience. Introducing from left to right, or your right, all the way down, we have Jerome Zaremba, Counsel and Assistant Corporate Secretary for Ford Motor Company. Don Kunz, Partner and Chair at Honigman. And Zally Ahmadi, to my left, Director of Corporate Governance at D.F. King. At the conclusion of each presentation, as I mentioned, questions will be fielded. If you have any questions at the conclusion, happy to stick around and answer those. With that, we're going to kick everything off with virtual shareholder meetings, and Jerome Zaremba.
Yeah. Thanks, Mike, and warm word of welcome to all of you. I'd like to thank Jim, Nick, and Trevor for hosting us today. I think this is a great opportunity for some good discussion about some topics that are timely for us all. So, let's see. Doesn't sound good.
It was working.
Okay. Well, you can see our pictures, and hopefully the camera survived the experience in my case. So Ford and virtual annual shareholder meetings. So at Ford, our first virtual annual meeting took place in 2017. And we had spent 2 or 3 years considering whether we wanted to do a virtual annual meeting. We're nothing if not diligent at Ford Motor Company, taking 3 years to decide. But during that 3 years, we benchmarked several companies. We talked to people like Intel and Hewlett-Packard to get some ideas as to how their experience was with virtual annual meetings, who was the best provider, and whether they accomplished the goals that they wanted to accomplish. So when we analyzed it, we thought there were a few advantages that we would hopefully achieve. One was increased shareholder participation. And I'll go into a little bit about what our experience was with our in-person meetings compared to what our experience has been for the past 3 years with our virtual meetings. We also were concerned about meeting efficiency. So when we held in-person meetings, we held them in Wilmington, Delaware. Delaware is our state of incorporation, and so we just decided to hold them there. We typically had a board meeting the day prior to our annual meeting, and so that meant moving the board and executives and all the support staff out to Wilmington, Delaware to the Hotel DuPont to hold the board meeting, and then the following day, the annual meeting. That was very inefficient in terms of executive times, our board members' time, as well as the staff. And as you can imagine, it cost a lot of money. And so the third thing we hoped to accomplish was the significant cost savings. Some potential disadvantages that we thought would happen was some shareholder feedback that would be less than positive. Some institutional shareholders had voiced displeasure with companies who had done virtual annual meetings, saying that management is hiding from their shareholders and they ought to be in person, look them in the eye, and that type of thing. We thought we would test it out to see if we had significant shareholder pushback or whether there would be any positive shareholder feedback from the virtual annual meetings. The other thing we considered was if there was a significant event going on in the company, it might not be appropriate to have a virtual meeting. So if you had a significant, let's say, as an example, government investigation that you were dealing with, you had a cyber attack that affected a lot of your customers, you had low TSR for several years, it might be more appropriate to have an in-person meeting as opposed to a virtual meeting. In our case, we didn't have any of those issues, so we proceeded in 2017 to go with the virtual annual meeting. So the preparation was was significant. So we selected Broadridge Financial Solutions to host the meeting. They're about the only game in town. There are a couple other entities that provide virtual meeting services. Our transfer agent, ComputerShare, provided it, but it was coordinating the beneficial ownership with the registered ownership through ComputerShare would have been rather difficult. Broadridge, it's pretty seamless, and it's fairly easy, so we decided to go with them. Broadridge hosted, at least the latest statistics that we were provided, 285 virtual meetings in 2018, which is up from just 27 in 2010. So there's been a lot of buy-in over the years, and we think we'll probably see, as time goes on, more and more buy-in, other companies having virtual meetings. So how did we go about informing our shareholders? Well, obviously in the proxy statement, that's our main communication. And we emphasized at a lot of places in this proxy statement that there would be no physical location for the meeting. It was going to be virtual. Gave them lots of information as to how they could log into the meeting, what time they could log in, and what they would experience. And we wanted to really emphasize that we were doing this to increase shareholder participation. And I think we accomplished that, as I'll show you some statistics a little bit later. So to encourage participation, what we did in 2017 and 2018 is we opened, if you log on to Broadridge's voting website, which we all have, for virtual annual meetings, they do have a little question box that you can click on and submit a question. We opened the functionality to that about 3 days before the meeting, and because we wanted an idea of what was on shareholders' mind, and we had about 10 to 15 questions in the first 2 years. Last year, by mistake, and it turned out to be a serendipitous mistake, that box was open as soon as we filed our proxy statement. So as soon as the site went up, people could ask questions. And about a week and a half later, we realized that we had about 60 questions that had already been submitted. That turned out to be a good thing. And we think we'll do that again in 2020 if we hold a virtual meeting. And the reason it's a good thing is because you're able to prepare. You know what's on shareholders' mind. You can prepare the answers for your executives and have them prepared. And during the virtual annual meeting presentation, we do allow shareholders to IM questions to us live. And so the executives can then choose between the question they got, the questions we received prior, or they take a live question. For us, we thought it was really important because for our physical meetings, we have regulars who always come, and then we had about 23 regulars who, for the past 5 to 10 years, always showed up at our annual meetings and always would come and ask a question and have some interaction with our directors and our executives. And so Bill Ford was very concerned that he didn't want to offend these people. And so we drafted a letter for Bill to send to each of those 23 regulars, explaining what we were doing, why we were doing it, and hope that they would participate in the virtual meeting. You want to be a little bit careful if you do that, because if you go beyond what's in your proxy statement, you may have to file additional solicitation materials. But we pretty much stuck to the information that was in the proxy statement, so we didn't do the filing. In terms of internal coordination, there was a lot of coordination. So obviously you need your executives' buy-in and your board of directors' buy-in. As I said, we had 3 years worth of statistics, so the executives and the board were on board. They wanted to move this way because they realized it would be more efficient and we'd realize some cost savings. You want to get your investor relations entity and your communications group involved early, because they're the ones who are going to be getting the questions from your investors as well as the media as to what are you doing and why are you doing it and are you really hiding, and you want to have good responses to those. Security, you wouldn't think you'd really need security with a virtual meeting. The reason that we included them is because both Bill Ford and Etzel Ford were very concerned about shareholders showing up to our headquarters thinking that they could actually attend the meeting. They didn't want those shareholders to attend. We didn't want them to just turn them away at the door and say, you got it wrong, go log on. So what we did was set up in our lobby, we cordoned off a little bit of the lobby and set up a screen where they could view the meeting, and set up some computers so that if they wanted to submit a question or vote their shares, they had access to do it. Of the 3 years, no shareholders that has ever showed up at our headquarters to attend the meeting, which I guess says something about the reading comprehension level of our shareholders. Probably the most important group to get involved is your IT group. They really need to get involved early and often with Broadridge. And that is just really, really important. I'm not an IT expert, don't pretend to be, but it is very important to get people who are experts coordinate with Broadridge so that when the meeting happens, your shareholders aren't annoyed, your executives aren't annoyed, and the people who are presenting do so in a seamless way. Another important thing that we did was, particularly the first year, we performed about 5 dry runs with Broadridge. So what we did is basically a small group from the Secretary's office would get together and we'd just act out the meeting. It would be literally, we'd read through the script, we would pretend people would be calling in as shareholder proponents, presenting their proposals, went through the Q&A website, and we did that for a few reasons. One, we wanted to get the timing, how long this was going to take. And secondly, we found a lot of lessons learned in each of the dry runs in order to improve the experience for our shareholders and for our executives. The very last dry run was about 3 or 4 days prior to the meeting, and we had our executives come in. Now, they didn't go through the script, but we wanted them to get familiar with the setup, with the platform, how things were going to run, and we found that to be extremely helpful. So this is the meeting site that you log into, and it's pretty self-explanatory, but I'll run through it quickly. So on the top left-hand corner is that can be used for video if you're going to stream it live. So we don't. Ours is audio only. We do use that screen, though, about a half hour before the meeting starts. Our meeting starts generally at 8:30 in the morning. So at 8 o'clock in the morning, when people begin to log into the meeting, we'll run some commercials of our products from all over the world. So it's not just US commercials that everyone's used to, but it's commercials from Asia and South America and Europe. And it's a good connection because you're advertising your product, so that's not a bad thing. And you'll see at the bottom of that corner, there's some closed captions. So if people are hearing impaired, they can still read along with what's going on with the meeting. On the top right-hand corner, that's just the agenda of the meeting, and so people can follow along where we're at. We also, on the left-hand corner, go back there just briefly. So after the CEO's report, we do run a year in review video, and that's about a 3 to 5 minute video. And that's kind of important because it allows us to get prepared for the Q&A session, so it allows us to queue up the questions, which questions will be answered, who will be answering them. And so we found that very useful. If you go to the bottom right-hand corner, you can see the vote here. So if people want to vote, if they haven't already voted the shares, or as a result of something being said in the meeting, they want to change the vote, they can do that right there. And then they have access to the meeting materials, the proxy statement, annual report, our websites, and then the meeting rules and conduct. And of course, on the left-hand lower corner, you can actually submit a question during the meeting and click the submit button. And so this is what the Q&A portal looks like. Now, the shareholders can't see this, only internal people can see it. And typically what happens is I'll be sitting in the meeting room and for our meetings, we have our chairman, our CEO, CFO, general counsel, and corporate secretary present. And so they're the ones who will be answering the questions. So this will be on my computer. My computer screen will be projected to some larger computer screens in the room. And typically, Bill Ford controls the questions. So he will read the question, and I gotta give him credit, because he does read them verbatim, and some of them are not very nice. But he does read them verbatim, and we respond to them, and I think that's very important if you're going to do it, to read the questions verbatim. Don't sugarcoat them, because you really want shareholders to understand that this is transparent, that you're not hiding from investors. And then, so Bill will read the question, then you can see the green mark answered or delete button. If you're ever in my position, where you're the one who's controlling it after they read the question, you can mark it answered or delete. Make sure that the chairman finishes reading the question prior to marking it answered or delete, because once you do that, the question disappears and it'll just roll on. It makes for a much more pleasant meeting for everyone. So here's the measurement of success. So you can see 2016 was the last physical meeting we had, and that statistics for 2016 are representative of the prior 4 or 5 years of annual meetings. So it lasted about 60 minutes. We had about 59 attendees, and we answered about 9 questions. And the reason we answered 9 questions is because that's all the questions people asked. There were no more questions, and so we ended the meeting at that point. In the 3 years that we've had a virtual meeting, you can see that the meeting has lasted a little bit longer, from 70 to 80 minutes. The number of participants has increased dramatically, which is something that we were hoping that would happen. And in terms of negative feedback, after the 2017 meeting, the controller for the city of New York sent us a nice little letter that said, if you ever do this again, we're going to vote against all of your directors because we don't think it's correct or appropriate that you have a virtual meeting without a physical meeting. As you can see, we didn't pay much attention to that. But I don't know whether they did vote against our directors or not, because the vote for our directors really hasn't changed in the 3 years. So I don't think any other institutional investor had that attitude. But we did get a lot of positive feedback from our retail investors. A lot of them wrote to us either through email or through the Q&A section of the screen, and just say, hey, really appreciate you guys doing this. This is the only way I can take part in an annual meeting, because otherwise they have to travel somewhere. And you might ask, well, why don't you do both? Why don't you do a hybrid meeting, both a physical meeting and a virtual meeting? And the reason we didn't do that and haven't done that is because then you don't realize the economics. You don't get the efficiencies that we discussed earlier or the cost savings. And so maybe at some point we'll do that, but right now we're not. And the questions, we answer a lot more, or a significant amount more during the virtual meeting than we did in the physical meetings. And then you'll see that we also committed to shareholders that for any question that we didn't get to during the actual meeting, we would post those questions verbatim online and the answers to those questions to our website. And we did that within a business day or 2 of the end of the meeting. Because you're getting questions during the meeting, you have to prepare answers for them and organize them. Now, we grouped questions, so we had a lot of questions on our TSR or on our dividend, so we'd group those questions together and give one answer at the end of the list of those questions, which we think is more efficient. But again, it's a good thing to do because of transparency. Where's my button? So, key takeaways for us. Again, preparation is key. Multiple dry runs is really important. Making an effort to have shareholders participate is really important. And I think we've accomplished those, as you saw from the statistics. The cost savings for us were significant. We calculated we saved about between $200,000 and $300,000, which was significant. Now, that's not going to work for every company. I've talked to companies who have very few shareholders, if any shareholders show up at their annual meeting. And they said, they just go down to the local Ramada Inn, get a conference room, have their meeting, in 15 minutes they're done. So it really wouldn't make any sense for them to have a virtual meeting. I think the base cost for Broadridge was around $25,000 to do this. So again, it depends upon your company and your particular circumstances whether that will work for you. It doesn't create a lot of workload for the Secretary's office. When we had physical meetings, we had a group who were in charge of events, for corporate events for the company, and they were basically in charge for all the logistics. For a virtual meeting, that fell to the Corporate Secretary's office. So that increased our workload, but overall, obviously the workload decreased from a company perspective. Some future enhancements, make sure that you talk to Broadridge and you have them tell you which is the best browser to log into the meeting because you don't want shareholders to have a problem logging into the meeting because they have a browser that isn't as compatible. So that's really important. We also considered limiting, and had in 2019, limit the number of questions any shareholder can ask. If any of you have the pleasure of having John Chevedden as a shareholder, John does not like virtual annual meetings. Hey, Ed. And he just bombarded us with questions the first year. I think we got 36 questions from John. All relevant questions, but nevertheless, eating up a lot of our time. The previous 2 years, 2019 and 2018, I think it was around 20 questions each year. So we said, the shareholder can't submit more than 3 questions, and if they did, then we would just ignore any question beyond the first 3, and that's what we've done. And then, again, the last point is asking Broadridge more detail, if possible, about the people who log in and who are asking questions. Bill Ford really likes to have a personal connection with shareholders, and as I said, with the 23 regulars, he would really like to know if it's someone that he recognizes, because he will make a personal comment to them during the meeting. It is just something that's his personal preference, whether that works for you or not. Again, it's up to you. So that's about all I have for virtual annual meetings, and I'm happy to take any questions if anyone has them.
Jerome, I have a question. So 3 years in, you've worked out all the kinks as it pertains to workflow with Broadridge. Best advice you can give the audience as far as what to look for, what to avoid? I know you've mentioned a few things as far as enhancements are concerned, but what advice would you give everyone here as it pertains to hosting either a virtual meeting, a hybrid, or just stick with the status quo?
Yeah, again, it's going to be very company specific in terms of whether you go virtual or stick with your status quo, and whether you realize any efficiencies or cost savings. Lots of communication between Broadridge and the people who will actually be performing. So they have an operator who will introduce the meeting and will introduce shareholder proponents. It's good to get to know the operator and how that whole process is going to work. It is as many dry runs as you can reasonably do will really help, because each dry run you learn a little bit more about how things are going to run and things to avoid. So those are the things I would suggest. And then, do some analysis. Don't take 2 or 3 years to do your analysis. Hopefully this will help you make a decision. But yeah, do some analysis, really see what efficiencies you realize, what cost savings you realize, and then, make your decision.
Any questions?
Jerome, how did you, with the dry runs that you had, and for the meeting itself, with shareholder proposals,
Oh, sure.
that handoff, and how was that clean, and how did all that?
Yeah, so the shareholder proposals we had, and that's another good point that should be made. So you have to do some coordination with your shareholder proponents. Find out who is going to present the proposal. Give them lots of information in terms of when to call in, what will happen when they call in. And again, Broadridge has operators who will greet them and tell them, you will be placed on hold until it's ready to present your proposal. The first year we ran into a little bit of trouble with one of the proponents. We had sent them an email, giving them all of the information about, as the meeting started, he sent us a note saying, hey, got no information. What am I supposed to do? And we went, oh, for Pete's sakes. It was about 10 seconds prior to his proposal being introduced that he was actually got online. So that was cutting a little close. So now not only do we send emails, we follow up with FedEx packages, we follow up with phone calls. We make sure that whoever is going to present a proposal has all the information they need. And if they're not on the phone with Broadridge 15 minutes prior to the meeting start, we will start calling them and asking them to, hey, where are you? Want to make sure you have all the information, want to make sure you're going to be ready. If it turns out that there is some technical difficulty, our position is that we will present the proposal on the proponent's behalf, particularly if it is a technical difficulty. If they just don't call in, I guess we could take the position that we don't need to present the proposal and then exclude their proposals for the next 2 or 3 years, whatever the rule says. Typically, we haven't done that. In fact, typically what we've done in the past, and this is unique to Ford as far as I can tell, we've always offered share proponents that we will present the proposal on their behalf and we will not hold that against them for excluding future proposals. But yeah, that's how we handle that.
Another question. How did you decide yours was audio and visual?
No, there's no video, just the audio. So the only video we had was the commercials prior to the meeting starting, and then after the CEO remarks, we had a 3 to 5 minute video, but sort of a year in review type of video. And again, we used that time to prepare the Q&A and who was going to answer which question. The reason we didn't do the video, at least so far, and I'm saying that we'll never do it, because I think GM did a video with their virtual meeting. We may do that. It's just easier if you're in the room deciding, you know, who's going to do what, or if someone wants to hand a note to someone else, it's not obvious on the video, or if, you know, Bill Ford points to our CFO and say, you're going to take that question, and the CFO says, no, I'm not, and Bill says, oh, yes, you are. All of that is not seen, so.
Did anybody avail themselves of the on-premises facilities that you set up?
No one has.
But you continue to have that available?
Yeah, we have. Both Bill and Edsel Ford are very concerned about a shareholder showing up and just being turned away. So, you know, it doesn't take much. It's a couple tables, a screen, and a couple of computers, and a few chairs, and just cordon off a part of our lobby, and if someone shows up, they can sit there and won't be offended by us saying, you know, get out. So.
And one final question with respect to the position that you've gone to this to increase shareholder participation.
Mm-hmm.
The criticism that you could have a physical meeting with a virtual component, the hybrid meeting,
Mm-hmm.
and achieve the same objective. How did you address that?
We haven't had a lot of questions about that, but the questions we have had, our response has been that at some point we may do that in the future, but by doing that, we wouldn't realize the efficiencies and the cost savings that we have been realizing for now, and we may do that in the future, but right now we don't think we will, and I don't know honestly what we'll do in 2020. The board will decide in December whether we do another virtual annual meeting or a hybrid or have a physical meeting. I would suspect we'll do what we've done the past 3 years, but obviously that's their decision.
Thank you.
Do your board members also attend electronically, or
Yep.
are some of them present in
But-
the room?
Yeah, last year one of them showed up in the room.
Okay.
Well, he told us he was going to show up. So, and they're welcome to if they want to, but typically, as I say, we have a board meeting the day before,
Yeah.
and after the board meeting, if they don't have to show up, then they like to get back to where they want to. But we do strongly encourage them to log into it, and we actually give them separate login credentials so that we know if they attend. Because we do get that question, you know, how do I know if your board is attending? And,
Right, you have to report.
right,
To
exactly,
Proxy,
exactly,
whether they attended, so you can track whether they logged in.
exactly. And my good friend John Chabedin will write me a note and say how many of your directors actually attended this. So.
And I'm sure that's true with your accountant as well.
Yep, the accountant is in the room. So if there are any accountant questions that roll in live, he is in the room and he can respond to. And one other thing about questions, very quickly, is that, so when proposals are presented, if you do get a question that rolls in related to a proposal, we do handle it in the Q&A session, but we have those questions as a priority, because we don't close off the voting ability until after the Q&A session. We think it's very important that if there is a question about one of the proposals that shareholders has, we respond to it prior to the voting being cut off. So.
Okay.
Hey, Jerome,
Yeah.
one quick one.
Yep.
Did you experience any increased frequency during the Q&A session of shareholders trying to make proposals from
Mhm.
some other procedural requirement had to be involved in order to maintain order to the meeting or avoid, an uncomfortable subject or otherwise.
Thankfully, no, we haven't. But please don't trust us.
Our experience may do it.
Yeah, yeah. Mhm.
Thank you, Jerome.
Yep.
Thank you very much.
You bet.
Don's going to take us through a review of the 2019 proxy season.
Thank you very much, and thank you so much for holding this. It's great to get together with a number of folks who practice in this area. I'm going to go through 3 different topics here, not the shareholder proposal topic, but first, opposition to director elections, second, say on pay, and third, equity plans and how those have been faring. And as the footnote says here, the statistics here are from 2 different sources. ISS publishes a report on the proxy season when the bulk of it has taken place. Obviously, with companies that have different year ends, we're not through this year's proxy cycle completely, but the bulk of it we're through with. And ISS has an early review that they publish, and then the law firm of Sullivan and Cromwell does a very thorough job with a 3-part series on the 2019 proxy season in review, which is where the statistics in here come from. With respect to opposition to director elections, as the slide says here, opposition increased in 2019 from 2018 among the Russell 3000. This is a kind of general barometer of what the shareholding public, which is dominated by institutions, feels about directors and the concern that they've got. As you can see, the low was 2.9% in 2015, and then the modern high was 9.4% against in 2009, right after the financial crisis. So last year, it was up from 4% to 4.9%, again, aggregate votes withheld from directors, notwithstanding the fact that ISS recommendations against directors decreased from 8.9% to 8.1%. So as a rough barometer of what's going on there, shareholders are a little bit more agitated about directors, and not because of ISS recommendations. And also, as you'll see, the ISS recommendations don't translate into the same amount of withheld votes. You've got about half to a little bit more that are actually following ISS in those circumstances. So why is ISS recommending against directors?
You can skip over that one.
Okay. Here we go. The top reasons for ISS adverse recommendations are here. I've listed the reason, the number of directors that they recommended against, and then in the next column is what the ultimate vote was in favor of those directors. So as you'll see, none of these reasons in general result in directors having more votes withheld than votes for, but the impact varies. For the topics that are of most significance here, third one down, inability of shareholders to amend bylaws resulted in directors only receiving 75% of the vote. Poor director attendance, which is our mandatory disclosure in the proxy statement about who attended at least 75% of the meetings, that resulted in 78% vote in favor. Lack of responsiveness to shareholder concerns is 58%. And what that really means is that's a circumstance where ISS has raised a concern in a prior year that hasn't been addressed. So sometimes there might be a shareholder proposal that had been approved, let's say recommendation of majority voting, and the board decided not to do that. That lack of responsiveness to a concern that had been previously mentioned is the most significant factor in terms of the number of votes actually withheld. And overboarding, being on too many boards, also is a significant determinant of vote at 69%. Moving on to say on pay, shareholder opposition to say on pay was also up last year for the second year in a row. We went from 9.4% that were less than 80% support to 12.9% to 13.5% in the last 3 years. And if you look at the actual failure of say-on-pay proposals, which is less than 50%, it was 2% for each of the last 2 years and 0.8% in 2017. Many of the companies that had difficulty in say-on-pay continue to have difficulty. So what you'll see here is that when companies get into a fix with respect to a pay issue, very often it isn't something that can be corrected terribly quickly. So it's not generally an annual policy. Most of these are factors that are more serious, pay for performance or other things where the ship can't be turned so quickly as to permit the company to get back into good graces as quickly as they might. So of the 54 Russell 3000 companies that failed in 2018, only 35 of them had greater than 50% support this year, and only 25 had greater than 70% support. So those companies continue to have difficulty there as well. As to why companies are being recommended against in the say-on-pay area, the most significant is alignment of pay and performance. So we have a situation where the company's performance vis-a-vis its peer group doesn't match the pay of the executives compared to the peer group. That is the most significant feature. Then you have also compensation committee non-responsiveness, change of control or severance provisions or other pay elements. And as you'll see, these tend to be present in bunches if they're present, in part because ISS doesn't necessarily look at all of this as carefully or report it as carefully until companies get into some difficulty. But 46 of the companies had issues, and 41 of those had alignment of pay and performance problems. So that is by far the most significant element. In terms of equity plan approvals, what you'll see here is that in this area, as I think many of you will know, ISS has a proprietary model that they use to analyze equity plans. And one can pay ISS to license that model and can understand just how ISS is going to come out, which provides a little bit of a conflict of interest between an entity that is both providing consulting services to companies as to how to structure equity plans and also ultimately making recommendations as to how shareholders ought to vote on those plans. The result of that, though, is that equity plans are not necessarily driven significantly by ISS recommendations, as you'll see here. ISS recommended against 25% of the equity plans presented by Russell 3000 companies, up from 23%. But of the 126 against recommendations, the average level of support from shareholders was 76%. And only 2 of those 126 ultimately failed. So in this area, at least, the ISS recommendation, although it's nice and it certainly makes one's life easier, and for those of us who counsel companies, causes you to sleep much better on the time leading up to the meeting. It doesn't necessarily mean that your plan is going to fail if you do not get the ISS recommendation. In terms of why ISS is recommending against, the first features there, the excessive plan cost or burn rate, are part of that ISS proprietary model. ISS will calculate both of those. You can make guesses as to where you're going to come out on those, but the model can change year to year, and it's a black box type of situation, so it's somewhat opaque as to where you're going to be there. The next 3, though, are things that one can discern and read about and structure an equity plan so as not to trip them, which I would certainly recommend. ISS publishes their voting guidelines. They have a number of different factors that they take into account when reviewing equity plans, and among those are provisions regarding acceleration of vesting authority, change of control vesting provisions, and liberal share recycling provisions, all of which are features of your plan that if you're using an old plan and marking up one that has worked in the past, that's not quite good enough. You need to make sure that the plan that you're using comports with the ISS recommendations, and that you don't run afoul of things that are fairly easily taken care of as long as you're aware of them and prepared to respond to them. So where we're going here, I think, is interesting. We have an era now of a number of different issues and concerns about capitalism, the country, concerns about looming recessions, about stewardship in a number of different ways, some debate about shareholder primacy versus a stakeholder corporate governance model, and a lot of different issues that are being raised these days on the ESG front, about which Sally's going to talk about in a little bit. And all of those, I think, are influencing shareholders to a greater extent than they have in a number of past years. So it's not all about economics these days. It's about a number of different factors that need to be taken into account. Questions from anyone? Yes?
Pay versus performance, there was a proposed rule of the SEC a couple of years ago that seems to have just gotten stuck. Do you have any insights if that clawback provision rule is going to move forward?
Certainly no. The question was, do we have any sense that there's anything going to move forward in terms of SEC rulemaking on the pay for performance front and also the Dodd-Frank clawback provision? And I do not. I have, when I've asked about that, I've been told that it's, particularly the clawback, is still something that the Commission's concerned about. It's not like conflict minerals or something that they're just as soon avoid. It's something that is on their agenda, but it doesn't seem to move forward, and no real insight as to when that might happen. Other questions?
I have a question. ISS and Glass Lewis obviously have a huge impact on issuers. I know that there was some talk about regulating both agencies, and I just wanted to see if there was any updates as it pertains to.
Yeah, there is an update. There was commission. The commission has taken action again this year, but not directly against the proxy advisory services. What the commission has been doing in this area has instead been regulating the institutions who use those services, and has come out with pronouncements that fiduciaries who vote shares of the funds, the various different entities that own the shares, must, in exercise of their fiduciary duty, do their own diligence and their own work in terms of determining how to vote shares, and they can't merely subscribe to ISS or Glass Lewis and take their recommendations and act on them. So they've imposed a requirement on the institutions that they actually do some independent review and analysis. I feel for the institutions. There are huge numbers of stocks. If you've got an index fund or something like that, you can have positions in any number of different companies, and proxy season tends to hit all at one time, and trying to wade through materials and determine how to vote isn't necessarily easy. But as the results showed earlier, clearly in the equity plan area, it would be an easy area to say, I'm not going to pay a great deal of attention to ISS or Glass Lewis. I'll make my own decisions there. There has been certainly talk about decoupling the conflict of interest that ISS has. There's also been talk about regulating those services more directly, trying to make recommendations more transparent. As of the moment, at least, nothing is happening there, and I think it would be more likely to result from congressional action at this point than commission action. Other questions? Yes.
Have you heard any word about whether there will be any additional clarity in the shareholder proposal area that the SEC is saying we may respond
Now that's an interesting one. I would say that the question was, do I have any insight into what's going on in terms of the SEC's plans for dealing with responses to requests to omit shareholder proposals? In recent years, as the Commission has been not terribly active in that area, and in fact, it's been hard to get the Commission even to issue a no action letter when a proponent clearly violates a technical requirement. The Commission has said that they will start to respond orally, as you say, not respond in writing to things unless they are more significantly precedential. If this means that one will be able to get a no action decision out of the Commission one way or another, I think that would be a very good result. But I think there's skepticism as to just how much time can be devoted to this and whether there'll be a significantly different approach to requests for no action letter on the shareholder proposal front. So I think it's, most of us are from Missouri as to whether that's actually going to happen.
How do you recommend, so the typical process, after you submit your no action request, and you may, wait a month or so, a little longer than that, and you are generally certain that there would, a response would come. It might not come in the time frame that, they typically say that they're going to do it. There would be a response. Now you're uncertain whether they're going to respond at all. Do you recommend contacting them after a certain period to indicate, are you even going to respond?
Yes, yes. I think it's going to be necessary to reach out in those circumstances. I'm hopeful that won't be necessary. That with the new program there will be some sort of response to every registrant, even if it's just that we aren't going to respond to this one. But clearly, I think if one's not getting a response, an inquiry like that can make sense. I've found that the first inquiry generally goes okay. More than one, you're kind of taking your life into your hands when you're trying to push that way, no matter what the people who are telling you what to do tell you. But I think the first inquiry is fairly risk-free. Other questions? If not, I will turn it over to Zally, who's going to speak on the ESG topic.
Thank you. So I'm going to do an overview of shareholder proposals. We have this kind of focus on ESG just because it's in the spotlight, and now over half of shareholder proposals are related to environmental, social concerns. But what I'm going to do is I kind of have split this topic into 3 different categories: environmental, social, and governance, hence ESG. So why don't we start off by going through and looking at a quick overview of the total landscape. Right on this here, I have a list of the top 10 proposals, and we say top 10 as in, these are the highest level of submissions that we've seen, and sort of displayed by topic as well. It's really hard to read that, so I'll walk you through some of the more important parts. I think the first thing that I want to talk about, though, is just sort of acknowledge the fact that almost 80% of shareholder proposals, they're filed at the S&P 500 companies. Not every company is in the S&P 500, so we get a lot of questions, about, well, why are we looking at this? Why is this important to us? We're a mid-cap company. And the response is, so the reason we like to look at what's going on in the shareholder proposal landscape is it really gives you a good idea as to what large institutions are looking at, where, potential amendments to their voting guidelines might be coming up, helps us identify the hot topics, and really, as we're going into fall, it helps us better prepare our clients for engagement sessions with investors. What could they be talking about? Where could you shore up in terms of your responses to their questions? So looking at this top, I think there might be 11 on here, but the top shareholders here, The main changes that we've seen over the past few years is just that now it's a very diverse landscape of, you have environmental related proposals is the second highest bar there, following lobbying and political contributions, right? And you don't even get to governance until the third highest, that being independent chair, whereas, just 5 years ago, it was entirely dominated by corporate governance related topics. So now you see these environmental social concerns making their way up to the top and really dominating the conversation as well that investors are having with issuers. I think another common question that we get when we do this chart every year is, well, what's Chevedden doing now? How much of these are influenced by him and his friends? And it just really sort of helps issuers get a sense of what they have to deal with when it comes to gadflies. Last year, it was the year of the special meeting proposals when it came to Chevedden and McRitchie and Myra Young. This year, they sort of fell away from that topic, and focused a little bit more on the lobbying, the political contributions, independent chair, and in this next slide here, we have an overview of the corporate governance proposals. This is where you can really see how those numbers changed. So last year, we had almost 80 special meeting related proposals, largely due to a result of corporate gadflies. Now it's the last bar on that chart there, and we're at less than 30. So that's the shift that we saw in terms of governance. It's just that, different topics come to the forefront depending on what, how many of these proposals are being thrown out there by these guys. Requiring independent chair, that's definitely the foremost proposal in corporate governance for 2019. That being said, none of them passed. So typically larger investors are okay with, a combined chair CEO situation as long as you have a lead independent director with robust responsibilities defined. I'll note on proxy access as well, just because it took up so much of the conversation a few years ago. Definitely numbers have dwindled for proxy access proposals. That's because, again, most companies in the S&P 500 have adopted a provision, and most proposals are filed at the S&P 500. That being said, proposals to adopt proxy access, they still have teeth, and they're still passing. The reason that you see such low vote results now for the proxy access related proposals, it's because, the amendments to proxy access, these are the ones that are being filed and not passing. These are the ones that Chevedden and his friends are focusing on as well. If you already have a provision, they want to see you amend it, lower some thresholds, change that up. Those aren't really going anywhere. So really the only thing you still have to worry about if you don't have a proxy access provision is if you get a request to adopt it. And then I think the one other thing that I'll note here is the majority vote for election of directors. Significant increase in those proposals this year as well. CalPERS was behind a big push for this. So that's a proposal topic that's actually being pushed by an investor that, of course, companies take all investors seriously, but one that they might pay a little bit more attention to here. So now going on to just some quick takeaways from governance. Overall pass rate is declining. A lot of this is because, again, we're seeing less proposals, for example, for proxy access. More companies are adopting it. We're seeing these fringe proposals asking for amendments to certain provisions, So that's why, in terms of governance, a lot of it is more black and white when it comes to what what your investors want. How your largest institutions are going to vote on a lot of these issues. So when you get a governance related proposal, you kind of know how you're going to respond. You know whether you're going to adopt the provision or not. And this all leads to the pass rate declining for the ones that actually do make it to a vote, because oftentimes, for example, if you get a proposal to declassify your board, you're going to have to address that. So nearly half the proposals, they are board related, and that kind of follows this focus that investors have on your board. And we'll talk a little bit later about whether that includes tenure, diversity, gender, but in the governance sphere, a lot of these proposals are board related. Your majority voting for director elections, independent board chair, that sort of thing. Still a very strong focus on the board. And then I think the last thing that I'll note on here is that we're also seeing a lot of management proposals in addition to shareholder proposals, just to change for these better corporate governance changes. I think that when it comes to corporate governance, a lot of the conversation, you don't have a lot of new conversation going there, boards know what they need to give up and when they need to give it up when it comes to these issues. So moving on into environmental proposals, this subject kind of stole the show for the last 2 years because we saw a few climate change proposals passing, made a lot of headlines. I think what's really interesting about 2019 is that we didn't see any of those proposals pass. Now that being said, climate change still gets the highest level of vote results for environmental related proposals. So typically when I see a client get an environmental proposal, that's the first thing that I will ask is whether it has to do with climate change. And the only other thing that I will say on this is that we saw a significantly lower percentage of proposals related to environmental reasons being filed as well. No action relief for environmental proposals. It's the highest it's been over the last 3 years, so that's another reason, we're seeing less of these proposals. And I think in addition to this, it's very easy to look at this and say, okay, attention is shifting away from environmental related concerns. I don't think that's the actual takeaway. I think the real takeaway is that it did garner so much spotlight over the last 2 years that we saw this influx of issuers, rushing to sort of increase disclosure around these issues. We see a lot more companies publishing websites to talk about what they're doing in this realm, which ultimately leads to engagement, with your investors and fewer votes for these proposals if they come to play. Couple of quick takeaways here. Most proposals don't go to a vote for environmental takeaways. This goes for social as well, but especially when you're comparing environmental governance and social, the environmental side, a lot of it gets negated by discussion with the large investors, discussion with the proponents, no action relief, or they're just not making it anymore. I think one really interesting thing that happened this proxy season was the emergence of these anti-ESG proposals. A couple of the oil companies, they received these proposals saying, hey, we want you to not consider environmental concerns when you're looking into your next big acquisition, when you're looking into what's next for your strategic direction. So that was really interesting. I mean, the ones that did go to a vote for those, they were very low, but that's sort of the new topic in environmental. Everything else, it is similar to what we've been seeing. Main takeaway is just that none passed this year. So heading into a quick overview of the social proposals for 2019, I think the one thing that I'll note is that it was kind of the year of the social proposal. It had the highest number of submissions. When we're looking at this, I think it was almost 100 more proposals than we saw the year before. A lot of what we're seeing in the social sphere as well is following what we're seeing in the news. Political climate influences this as well. Political lobbying proposals are definitely the highest in terms of the number of submissions. And what's interesting about those proposals as well is usually we don't really see any pass. We saw 2 or 3 pass this year, so that'll be interesting to see where that goes as we go into 2020, whether there will be higher support or an increase in the number of submissions here. Board diversity has been a very hot topic over the last few years. I have a slide on this as well, so I'll just kind of skip over that for now. But I think that another interesting thing that we're seeing in the social realm is that pay-related proposals are making its way into the top social side. So we have gender pay gap. We have linking exec pay to social criteria. Over the last 5 or so years, exec comp related proposals have been going out of vogue, and now we're seeing them creep their way back in and get and get higher support levels as well. First time initiatives, immigrant detention related proposals, human rights related proposals, things that you're seeing in the news are making their way into what investors are now voting on and discussing. Some tech companies have dealt with facial proposals, requesting information on whether facial recognition technology is being used when looking for illegal immigrants. So going on to just a quick slide on human capital management. Definitely sort of an in-depth dive into what we saw in the social sphere there. There was a significant increase in 2019, which is why I wanted to go over this. And these are proposals like gender pay gap, sexual harassment, employment diversity, more proposals there, and some spikes in shareholder support as well. A lot of this topic is also dominating the engagement discussions that our clients are having with shareholders as well, which is why we wanted to take a quick note to touch up on it. I think that another reason that people are talking about it is that, you know, there are some proposed rules in the SEC, whereas, you know, you might have to address this going forward. To be seen, you know, the extent of that, but this is definitely something that's on a lot of issuers' minds, not only because investors want to talk about it, but also because it might actually affect, you know, the way that you prep for the next proxy season. And then the one last thing that I'll bring up here is just, you know, a quick touch on board diversity. You know, this has kind of been a multifaceted approach by investors, regulatory bodies, ISS, Glass Lewis, just to sort of bring more attention to this. A few quick stats, you know, Russell 3000, there's still about 400 companies that have all male boards on the Russell 3000. So it's definitely still pertinent. You know, BlackRock just a year ago, they amended their guidelines to say, okay, we want to see 2 directors. And they did this in February, right as we're going into the proxy season. So issuers kind of had this, you know, reaction of, okay, I hear what you're saying, let's get through proxy season and let's talk about it, right? But then what we saw, so BlackRock votes pretty close to the annual meeting. What we saw was that they would come in with their votes about a month before the annual meeting. And these votes were coming in against directors for this reason. And they would reach out to the company as well to state, hey, you know, you don't have 2 females on your board. Do you want to talk about this? Because we are voting against your board members. And so there was this sort of rush of companies to really talk to BlackRock about this. And what ended up happening was, you know, they had to make compromises. They had to either agree to, you know, within a certain time frame add directors, or, you know, agree to formalize their search process, bring in third-party search firms, and making sure that the most diverse group of candidates are in front of them at all times. So that's just one example as to why this is such a bigger deal. You know, State Street's going to vote against any board that doesn't have any male directors. Vanguard, who has typically been very, you know, reluctant to sort of get into the game of pushing for change, they've even come out with statements to state that, you know, this is what we're looking at. We are looking at diversity. Glass Lewis ISS now have actual guidelines where going into this next proxy season, they'll vote against all male boards in certain situations. And then you have the state regulatory side. So, you know, California now requires for companies headquartered there, a certain percentage of your board be female directors, depending on how large your board is. There's 2 types of approaches to this sort of state mandated regulation. There's the actual requirement of having, you know, a certain number of female directors, but then other states like Illinois, for example, they would like to start requiring companies to disclose percentage of females, that sort of thing, so that they can produce an annual report about this type of data. So different approaches by different bodies, and I think that the last thing that I'll note on this is just that, just based on what we've seen in terms of the changes that we're seeing and who's implementing more females on their boards, the industries that have had the least amount of females historically are actually making the most or the strongest push to add more female directors. So that was an interesting, you know, sort of study that we read about recently. But I think at the end of the day, you know, actually one other story that I'll say is, it doesn't end there. It doesn't end by just adding more females to the board, or even let's expand that beyond females, right? Just diversity as a whole, tenure diversity, skill set diversity. And I say this because one of our clients over this past season, they added the 2 females, right? They were really proud of that. And they said, great, we are going to go to BlackRock and we are going to get our kudos. We're going to talk to them. And this is a company that did not, you know, have a heavy engagement program in the past. So they go to BlackRock and they sit down and they say, okay, we did this, you know, we're good. And the response was, you know, kind of along the lines of, okay, yeah, you did that, but that's not what we want to talk about. does it stop there? You know, what's your process? Do you have a process where you're putting people in front of your board at regular intervals? Do you, which committee is in charge of this? You know, are you just gonna let the ball drop now that you've added 2 females? So it's an ongoing discussion about diversity, and that's just something, to keep in mind as we go into fall, as we're engaging with our top investors, to just be prepared to talk about the process as well as the goals. And that's all I've got for shareholder proposals. Happy to answer any questions as well.
I have a question on the diversity side. Well, it's not really diversity, but as far as the pecking order is concerned, and level of importance, obviously gender or diversity. What about age and tenure? Is that
That's a good question. I think that we talk a lot about gender because that is where a lot of the discussion is. For example, the New York Comptroller, their big push for the Board Accountability 2.0, it was beyond gender. They wanted to see ethnicity, they wanted to see age, they wanted to see tenure. So that's a discussion that's being had. It's just, most of the talk is around gender diversity. That being said, with what the comptroller wanted to see, issuers weren't going out and displaying charts with all the ethnic diversity being displayed for their directors. I've heard of a few large institutional investors, kind of off the record say, well, we do care about, for example, diversity and ethnicity, but the only way we really look at that is if they disclose photos, right? So we can give them internal points if they have the photos disclosed, but we're not going to ask them to actually state, what the ethnicity is for everyone. When it comes to tenure and age limits, that's a conversation that's always been a part of board refreshment, right? And that's something that's being talked about as a topic as well. It's, tenure limits, age limits, that's not something that we're seeing being implemented, and that's not something that we recommend either. Term limits are rare for US, age limits are a little bit more common, but at the end of the day, and this is a sentiment that's echoed by Glass Lewis, ISS, investors, we'd rather not see you implement a cap and then just override it. We would rather just see you talk about why, how often you look at board refreshment, how often you're bringing in new people, and why these directors should be on the board despite their, long tenure.
Any other questions? I'd like to thank Jerome, Don, and Zally for joining us today. Thank you all for attending. We really appreciate it. The panel did a great job. Thank you, Nick and Jim, for setting this up. We really appreciate it. For those of you who are interested, I know it's kind of off topic and it's a shameless plug for Toppan Merrill, but if you are interested in having a proxy consult as it pertains to workflow, shareholder connectivity, please see Jim or Nick. We'll set something up for you. Essentially, it's what we refer to as an annual meeting checkup. We review all the processes that you go through during the course of the year, not necessarily just the financial print side, but the way you construct your documents, the way you file them, the way you prepare them, and how you disseminate them. So please make sure to stop by and say hello to Nick and Jim, and let them know if you're interested or not. There's no obligation, and the consult is absolutely free of charge. Thank you all for coming. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
You did a good job for
Thanks.
Sally did a great job.